This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Bloomsbury Festival. We're going to be talking about Resurrecting Lost London Fictions. I'll be your chair. My name's Andrew Whitehead, and I'll be introducing Ken Worpole and Cathi Unsworth, and we'll all speak for 10 or 15 minutes about particular lost London fictions which we believe are worth resurrecting. And the reason why I'm here is because of the book whose cover you see on the screen. I co-edited a book called London Fictions along with historian Jerry White, and you can probably tell already I'm not a Londoner. I'm from Yorkshire and I live in exile in London, but I've been here for about 30 years. And when I moved to London I was completely excited and mesmerised by the city, and I got to know my new city by walking it and reading about it and reading novels with a strong sense of a London locality. And as I read those novels, I was tempted to go and walk around a new area of the city which had previously been unknown to me, and I'm still doing that. So I read Zadie Smith's N.W., which came out last year, and I felt I had to walk around Willesden Lane and Wilson Green and that area, which I did with great joy, and it introduced me to a part of the city that otherwise had been closed to me. The book has 26 historians, writers, critics, enthusiasts, each writing about a commanding London novel and the city that it depicts. And Ken and Cathi are among the contributors. In the book they write respectively about Alexander Barham's The Lowlife and Lynn Reed Banks's The L-Shaped Room, neither of which are really lost, although you can argue that The Lowlife perhaps once was. And we look at a whole range of books. Mrs. Dalloway is clearly hugely well known. A couple of others are in the lost category, so particularly one of the books that we look at in London Fictions is a book of short stories set in Shadwell by the Docks in the 1890s by Henry Wood Nevinson, who taught at Toynbee and ran a cadet volunteer operation down in Shadwell. And he wrote a book of quite gritty but quite affectionate short stories about life in Shadwell in the 1890s, with the Docks at close hand. He wrote about things which not many people of that era wrote about. So he wrote about both cross-class and cross-racial romance in the Docklands area, and he wrote in Cockney. He wrote in dialect, and broadly I think he pulled that off, though it's not an easy thing to pull off. Ken's going to talk first, and Ken is a historian, oral historian, writer about the urban landscape and indeed about the estuary landscape. And his book, Dockers and Detectives, which came out first 30 years ago and was republished by Five Leaves a few years back, has probably done more than any other book in terms of resurrecting lost London fictions. He introduced a completely new audience to writers such as Simon Blumenfeld and Alexander Barham, and people who wrote particularly about the Jewish East End in the interwar years and immediately after the Second World War. But he's chosen a slightly different book and novelist to talk about now. Okay?
Thank you very much. Can people hear me okay? Yeah, good. Yes, thank you, Andrew. As Andrew just said, I was very involved in oral history in Hackney in the 1970s. And an early publication we did then was the autobiography of a shoemaker. Shoemaking had been a very important trade in Hackney, mostly done in people's homes. And Arthur Newton, who I recorded over many evenings, had been one of 9 boys, all growing up in a small terraced house in Hackney, and worked at home. And eventually we published his book. And I was looking for a place to launch it. And someone said, well, there's a pub down Balls Pond Road, the Duke of Wellington, and they have a small theatre out the back. And the landlord there is very keen on all sorts of artistic events and things on. And that was when I first met the man who ran the pub then, who was called Jerry O'Neill. Now, Jerry O'Neill has been even so forgotten that even Ian Sinclair doesn't know about him. And when I talked to Ian about him, he was rather surprised to hear that on his doorstep in Bullspond Road, there was a man who wrote no less than 6 acclaimed novels, but who has completely disappeared from English literary history, and certainly also, more importantly perhaps, from the London fictional canon. Jerry O'Neill was born in Ireland. He went to university, he was an educated man. He worked for 30 years in Africa in the banking industry, very anti-colonialist, and he decided when he came back to Britain he set up a family, and he took over the Duke of Wellington pub in 1967. And he was a man, you know, in that rather old-fashioned way, of a man of letters and a man with a tremendous love of theatre and of poetry. And I don't want to be kind of stereotypical, but I mean he had a very Dublin-esque flair for the life of letters. And it was a very interesting pub. It was a rather beautiful pub, lots of etched glass, and it sold Irish newspapers, it sold Sweet Afton cigarettes, and he both wrote plays, which he put on at the back, but he also encouraged all sorts of folk singers and playwrights to congregate there. And I think it's true that Hugh Whitemore's one rather famous play, Dar, was first played there. So I got to know Jerry O'Neill, but I didn't really realise that he had this separate life as a novelist. His first novel was a thriller, and the first, which is called Open Cut, and it sets, not surprisingly, in the building trade in London, amongst construction workers, lorry drivers. It's all pretty dodgy, it's all off the books, that no taxes get paid, the police are given bums to keep off the site because there's a lot of corruption going on, and so on. But he had a tremendous kind of affection for the Irish building workers of London. And the Irish building workers of London, that really was a tremendous population. I think it was something like, you know, 250,000 Irish workers were living, mostly men, without women, were living and working in London after the war, from 1945 through to the 1970s. It was a significant part of the population, particularly of North London. And yet their lives were rather kind of invisible to many novelists and poets and so on, but not to Jerry O'Neill. He had a tremendous sympathy for these often lonely men whose only kind of source of social life after work was basically the pub and the company of other men. So Open Cut was a success. It was a bit of a thriller. But his next novel, which is the one I'm going to read a couple of short extracts from, Duffy is Dead, I think is a fantastic novel. And it's all set in, almost all in the bar of the Duke of Wellington. One evening when 2 of his regulars come to the pub, well, first initially they ring him from a call box on the Holloway Road to tell him some bad news. And the publican is called Cownan, or Cowl as he's called. It's very much based on Jerry O'Neill. Jerry O'Neill, because he was an Irish man and he had this kind of, sold these newspapers in the pub, and he had very strong Irish folk singers and certainly Republican sympathies. And he also had a lot of trouble with the police, who would come in quite frequently, and if he didn't give them free drinks, then they'd plant something and he'd be hauled off the station, have to spend the night in the clink and then out again. So he was both a troubled man but also a very passionate man. So in this wonderful novel, Duffy is Dead, which you can get on A Books or Amazon, and it's a kind of mixture of Beckett. It's a three-hander. There's the landlord and the 2 Irishmen, Neenan and McKesson. It's very witty and dark and beautifully written. And in this first short extract I'm going to read, as I say, Cownan, he's in the pub, he's gone to sleep, and it's 4 in the morning and he gets a phone call from 2 of his regulars. Tirelessly the phone summoned him. He drank again, brought the bottle with him, and, angry and impatient now, went out across the bar, sensitive feet becoming aware of wet and dry. each discarded floor litter. Dog end, peanut hard shingle, wrapper, dog end, spittle, and inched his journey to the phone. A coin box mounted on the flock wall, framed in penciled numbers of whores and minicaps. Ring, 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 ring. He looked at it and drank again, and nipped for the road. If this instant of solace and warmth could last forever. Christ, the phone again. The clock over the figured mirror said 25 to 4, and he looked across at his reflection, naked but for a string vest, his great belly pushing out against it, so that it was raised, and his penis hung sadly. He saw stout, firm legs, fat thighs, a belly, a wattle of flesh at his jowls, and was shocked at the savage ugliness. Here's one of the two men ringing from Holloway Road. Black news, I'm afraid, Cal. I'm not going to do any Irish accents. Black as ink. Needham took it badly. He's sitting here on the curb, white as a sheet, hands trembling a bit. He can hardly light a fan. Calman looked at the telephone scribbles, graffiti. 3-speed arsehole pile. The governor is on the game. Can we have a new wall? The pilot lamp made a pool of light, and beyond it a vague crepuscular world. Traffic rumbled past. Again, silence. Are you still there, Cal? Yep. Duffy is dead. From the waste bin he could hear the rustle of crisp bags where the mice foraged. For months there had been a strange plethora of them, a plague. Once in the small house he had stood still, piercing the darkness until their every spastic move was visible. He had counted 38. Christ, 38. He drank from the bottle again. Did you hear? Duffy is dead. Yes. Needham took it bad. Delayed action shock, I'd call it. 45, same age as Duffy and myself. You see, but of course never exposed to the closeness of death. Death walking beside us always, I told him. Keep it in mind. I buried the father and 2 brothers in 6 months, you know. The first time under fire is a hard passage. There was an air of battles royal and combat fatigue about it all. Yes, Mackessie repeated, Needham took it bad. But he's not dead. No, Duffy is dead. You told me, Cal, whispered dangerously. You told me. It's a shock for you, Cal, I know, but I thought I'd give it to you straight from the shoulder. Best in the end. You're looking for a drink, aren't you, Cal said. Well, I wouldn't say no, and Needham needs a few shots. We're at the Archway. The Spades have a mini shop across the road. We could be down to you in 10 minutes. Cal's silence was consent. He rang off. Death opened groaning sluice gates of insincerity. Duffy, dead, owed him £10, he remembered. He put the brandy bottle on the cabinet and drank a glass of beer. He was accustomed to the darkness now and could peer into the littered corners of the bar. 5 hours ago, he pondered, there had been noise and smoke, confusion, faces, glasses, grins, and there was Duffy between Mackessie and Needham, the small greedy eyes scanning his universe. Now he was dead. £10, Calman thought, and he shrugged. He dried his dank hair with a bar towel, found a plastic mat to cover himself, and went out to stand on the pavement like some lost, witless bedlam. And in the next short piece, I mean, it's very full of North London. He's gone to see the undertaker because, as Jerry O'Neill once told me, I mean, the landlord or the publican in these Irish communities was also partly a banker, subber, and often he would be the person who had to arrange the funeral because these men were often without families, and he was the only kind of one with a bank account or with the wherewithal to do it all. But on the other hand, as you told me this in this book, it was all done. I mean, none of the Irishmen had proper names, they didn't register for taxes, they just made up every name for every job. There was an undertaker's in Upper Street, managed by the clincher Casey for the lower end of the market embarkations, and he caught a bus at the Archway. He passed the bank that would be forever Duffy's memorial and watched the greasy passage of Holloway Road to Highbury Corner. Holloway was cheap, Upper Street down a hill. Canonbury Chapels of Rest was closed for lunch, but he found the clincher in the next door pub, saloon bar, impeccable behind his Daily Telegraph. Half a bitter, cheese and wheat and bread. The clincher was a courtman of refined enunciation and a whole range of funereal postures and grimaces that endeared him to Calvin. If you took the job on, Calvin thought, you worked at it. Calvin brought him a pal of sherry and said, a fellow called Duffy is dead at the Whittington. Died on the road. They took him in. A friend? Christ, Calvin said. A customer? He nodded. Today is Friday. I want the funeral Monday. I know about DOAs and autopsies clincher. All queues can be jumped. He pushed a 20 into the clincher's waistcoat pocket. I'm buying peace at all costs. Pub deaths, pub debts, it's all the same thing. No next of kin, the clincher looked at the clock, at his watch. Do you want anything special? A respectable funeral, no more, no less. And your mouth shut, time. Has he a plot at Leinster, a grave? If he ever had a plot, it was a felony. The clincher laughed politely, a moment in disharmony with his profession. He enjoyed Calvin's scowling philanthropy. The clincher had a pale, plump face of some early newsreel of disaster, or peeping perhaps from a sepia still of patient ones huddled long ago on Ellis Island. Cremation then, that's it. The church allows it now. Do they? Calvin said. He bought himself a brandy. The lunchtime trade was gathering speed. A subby or two buying sandwiches and halves a bit of the council class living high and wide. In a corner, a studied untidiness of what might be schoolmasters or social toilets. A few gays, of course, calm, courteous, precise. I should get back, the clincher said. It was coming up for 2 o'clock. I often get a call, sometimes more, between 2 and half past. Funny, isn't it? Canterbury Chapels was ostentatious in its dignity beside a boozer. Gold sign writing on glossy blank. The window had a brass cross, tall, untenanted, standing on purple satin, a blue narrow neon tube, making a sorrowful patina in the lights and shades. A suspended scroll said, civility, courtesy, reverence. Reverence, Calvin said. Oh, you'd be surprised, the clincher pondered over it, at the business that pulls in. Your idea? asked Calvin asked. Oh yes, a letter of congratulation. The directors were impressed, preachers. He smiled. I have a great feeling, a disposition was the word for my calling. That was the gist. Reverence, Calvin said. That's it. Inside it was an empty shop. Brown lino, brown counter polyurethane like shellac, brown wood pattern wallpaper, broad-grained and knotted. A black and gold pedimented doorway to chapels of rest. There might be miles of ghostly space beyond it. There was no ceiling light, but a standard lamp screwed on the counter. A brass fist holding aloft a torch. It gleamed weakly in the daylight. I leave it at light even in daytime. Light has a certain comfort for the bereaved, a symbol of hope. Reverence, Calvin said. Well, that too. There was a little glass cubicle at the end of the counter where the unobserved clincher at his shelf could unwind. A hard-pawn glossy, mint sweets, magnifying glass, transistor, earphones, aerosol fly killer, an evening paper with a cryptic crossword unfinished were all neatly arranged. The clincher entered the details of Duffy's impending disposal in his day. Name and address of bereaved. That'll be you, Cal. Well, you'll think of something, clincher. Do your sums now like a good man and I'll pay you. And don't add anything for reverence and all that crap in the window. The clincher laughed delicately, paused a moment. Devine, he said, it is a name I like. Bereaved, Elmer Devine. Could be an American connection, relationship. We'll say you're his cousin. The business of countency was momentary. The figure scribbled on the blotter and immediately effaced. Special terms for you, Calvin said. From the fob pocket at his waistband, Calvin took a roll of 20s and paid and tipped. The clincher, charcoal suit, black tie, fragile hands, nodded. Calvin looked back from the door. The phone had rung and the clincher's face seemed to melt and ooze into the mouthpiece. Reverence, Calvin thought. He went back to the next door pub, brought a large brandy to a corner table, and opened the envelope of Duffy's effects. A silenced digital watch, a pub diary, a tie clip, £1.38 and a half pence flyleaf at the opening of the diary, designed as a comprehensive ID of the holder, merely said, name, Duffy James, collar, 15.5, Christ cannot fall, and a single entry of 1st of January, I like this sort of weather. And the book is just about that kind of process of which, you know, the landlord kind of arranges the lives of all these lonely Irishmen, and it's a fantastic story. He went on to write, I think, one of the best books about Africa, and some people have compared it to the novels of Graham Greene. This is Commissar Common. It's a wonderful novel. And then 3 novels about when he went back to Ireland. He was thrown out of the pub in 1980 because it was the time when landlords were being displaced as tenants, and well, they used to have much more autonomy, and then the brewing companies got rather powerful and wanted kind of managers that they could kind of pull the strings to. But for some 13 years, he ran this pub in Hackney, absolutely as a centre for Irish life. And when I was writing about O'Neill, I got in touch with the writer of, I think, the other truly great book about the Irish in London, which is Tim O'Grady's I Could Breathe the Sky. And Tim O'Grady said that, you know, for the Irish community in London, for folk singers, for writers, for poets, for musicians, that pub was actually the centre of North London cultural life. And it's strange that how it's been completely effaced from Hackney's history. There's nothing in the archives about him or his role there. And I think it's partly because he wasn't on the wrong side of the law, but there was a kind of parenthesis about the Irish in London in this period, to do obviously with the Troubles, which kind of put them outside of ordinary London life. And I think it's a really good time to bring O'Neill back into the mainstream of London fiction. Thank you.
Thanks. In case you're looking for the novelist or the book that Ken was reading from in second-hand bookshops or on websites, it's J.M. O'Neill, that's double L, and the book that he was reading from is entitled Duffy is Dead. Cathi Unsworth is herself a writer. She writes pop cultural crime fiction, and quite a few of her books have a profound sense of London. I'm thinking particularly of her book before last, about Penny Blues, and her most recent book is entitled Weirdo, and she's chosen a crime novel to talk about today.
Yeah, and because it ties in with my research for Bad Penny Blues, this novel. In fact, it became fairly integral to it. It's a beautiful pan edition you can see there. It's going to take us on a detour west of our current surroundings in Bloomsbury. It's a book that's very dear to my heart because it helped me immensely on the journey back in time that I undertook when writing Bad Penny Blues, a novel based on a true unsolved case that happened between West 1 and West 11 during the years 1959 to 64. It's set somewhere between those two locations where a lot of the action that I was investigating took place. A netherworld that I've never seen more vividly depicted than Kevin Fitzgerald's Trouble in West 2. During the course of working with Andrew and Ken on the London Fictions Project, we've often discussed that it's the novels of a period that bring London alive more profoundly than any historical record. In an obituary of Kevin Fitzgerald, published in The Independent a week after his death in November '93, David Cox, who was clearly an affectionate friend of the author, wrote that he was a gifted and highly entertaining writer, although the thrillers that make up the bulk of his published oeuvre would now seem badly dated, adding that he himself never took them very seriously. But it's precisely because Fitzgerald described the exact and very particular criminal milieu of West 2 so vividly, in all its period detail, that the reading of the book now feels like walking through a time tunnel and emerging in 1958 at a public house called The Case Has Altered. Fitzgerald's book, it has to be said, is never knowingly without a large whiskey in one hand and a cigarette in the other. And the characters who populate its rackety pubs and sinister after-hours specialist sex clubs, casinos and shebeens, speak in a vernacular peculiar to the time and the place. In this respect, Fitzgerald's writing has a great affinity with a handful of other writers who were, until very recently, equally as obscure, and have only really been brought back to light again by the efforts of hardcore aficionados. By using some of those as an example, I'm going to steer us northwards out of Bloomsbury and towards the Euston Road. Another interesting thread that we've discussed while doing London fictions is how authors of a similar bent end up populating the same locations throughout history. In the case of the pulp paperback practitioners that I favour, this is because they're following the money made by crooks. On the fringes of bohemian publishing houses, museums and universities of Bloomsbury, the environs of Euston Road were once notorious for cut and shunt garages and spielers known as mushroom clubs because of their propensity for popping up in shady areas. In the 20s, Patrick Hamilton set his pub, The Midnight Bell, a novella that would eventually become the trilogy known as 20,000 Streets Under the Sky, on the Euston Road, near the junction with Hampstead Road. His pub is a stage set for a doomed romance between barman Bob and a fallen woman called Jenny Maple that exactly mirrors the obsessive doomed affair that Hamilton had himself with a prostitute named Lily Connolly 2 years earlier. Further along, some 8 years later, Robert Westerby's Why Boys Never Work had an apprentice villain named Jim Bankley arriving from the Midlands to begin work for a spivvy second-hand car dealer called Graham Swing, whose premises and after-hours drinking activities thrived along the aptly named Warren Street. Westerby was a journalist with sporting connections which fed into his 1937 debut, recently republished by London Books. And the milieu that he depicts is clearly based on the real-life rackets of the Yiddisher and Sabini gangs who worked the racetracks between the wars. Nearly 50 years later, in 1984's He Died With His Eyes Open, which recently has been dramatised on Radio 4, Derek Raymond situated his dodgy minicab company, Planet Cars, just streets away in a dingy building behind Charlotte Street. This spiritual hangover from the days of Graham Swing was actually based on a real outfit for him Raymond worked in the 70s when he was down on his luck, a far cry from his halcyon youth spent fronting long firms for Charles de Silva and Associates of Craze in the early 60s. But as a field location for picking up gangster pallants and grist material on top of his fares, it was a goldmine. So if you've got a liking for any of those authors, then you'll recognise a kindred spirit in Kevin Fitzgerald. He was born in 1902 and, like Derek Raymond, into a background of wealth. As recounted in his 1986 memoir, With O'Leary in the Grave, his father acquired a 980 farm in Snow, Tipperary in 1919, ostensibly for the young Kevin to run. However, as the memoir's title, taken from the Yeats poem September 1913, alludes, this was not a good time for an English family to go into residence in Ireland. Instead, Kevin trained at Sealhain Agricultural College in Devon. Like Patrick Hamilton, his father was a bit of a monster. When Kevin finally returned to Tipperary to take up the reins of the farm, his father interfered and drove him away. First to Canada, where he worked on a prairie ranch, and then back to Ireland, where his background in agriculture helped him land a job at ICI. It was while he was a manager there that he began writing thrillers, and I can only surmise, because I don't know that much about him, that his work must have taken him to a certain quarter of London on a frequent basis during the 50s. So, head west down the Marylebone Road from Warren Street, turn left at Parade Street, and into the Warren of Mews that run between Paddington, Lancaster Gate and Bayswater. Here, in what he describes as a comfortable service flat, dwells the protagonist of Trouble in West 2, who, for all general purposes, is known as Major John Harrison, locally suspected of having private means and augmenting them with a little shrewd punting on the horses. Actually, Harrison is attached to an unnamed division of counterintelligence tracking foreign agents in the same Cold War climate and locale that the Carrier's George Smiley would emerge from 5 years later. There's something about West 2. And Fitzgerald puts it beautifully in the opening pages of the book. This is him. A taste for drink mixed with a fondness for low company will bring any man in time to the saloon bar of the Graces Altered. It's the end of a long road. Beyond lies the doss house and the little pubs where stolen money is spent on friends released in the morning. But in the Cases Altered, The money pouring into the 5 cash registers has either been earned or borrowed. Not all of the women customers will go to bed on request, and some of the men have reasonably steady jobs. The landlord, Mr. Harry Spieler, prides himself on keeping a respectable house. He drinks in the mornings, but not during the rush of evening trade. His wife, if he has a wife, is never seen, but he talks freely to favoured customers about the missus and enjoys smutty exchanges with the girls who run the 3-sided saloon bar. He is perhaps 50 years of age, and his face has the soft, pink smoothness of hard, tough men everywhere. It is whispered that Mr. Spieler has 4 times acted as public executioner, but there's never been any proof of this, and it could only have been from pleasure and not from need, since Mr. Spieler is rich. His donations to charity are a byword in all the trade, and all religious denominations in his district well their funds from his purse. He does not possess a motor car, but has been observed in the enclosures of all the London horse and dog tracks and have hired Rolls Royce. There is probably a case as old, and somebody like Mr. Spieler, in every big city in the country, but this one is in Bayswater, that strange group of London villages lying between Paddington and Leinster Terrace. Here live the women who haunt the park, and the women who live alone with dogs and half bottles of gin. Here are the hotels where coloured men are not subjected to insult, and where a scream in the night is not always a summons for the police. Here are the little shops where the casual customer gets what he wants and goes, while the favoured regular is sometimes handed the parcel containing his private photographs, his obscene book, his special cigarettes, or the underclothes for his girlfriend that are not stocked by better stores. Here the vices are discussed quite openly, and here are the little clubs which, unlike their counterparts in the West End, keep more or less ordinary licensing hours, but attract men and women of like mind to the basements of hotels or the first floors of stucco houses in the quiet, bleak streets. This is the moustache and hacking coat country, where live scores of majors and colonels who never served in the rank. But nobody minds or cares about that. All the strange women who share the public life. Everyone pays in cash round here, and there's plenty of it. All untaxed money from the dog tracks and the pools, the motor car second-hand market, and the scores of unspecified sources vaguely labelled commissions. And here people keep out of trouble. This is no place for knife fights or gang warfare, bag snatching or street rapes. Here no one can afford to be questioned by the police. Here all the men keep their secrets and the women their own counsel. This is the Mecca of the half-world. Trouble in West 2 was handed to me by a friend, writer and musician Max de Charnay, midway through the writing of Bad Penny Blues. Max is a bit of a connoisseur of pulp paperbacks, and this great pan edition with the corking strapline, "Trouble was his business, and business was good," and a fabulous front cover with a Stan Getz lookalike loading his gun, while a blonde twirling a wineglass looks on with amused raised eyebrows. Max must have somehow psychically sensed that the world outlined above was exactly the world I needed to get back to. The real-life murders I was researching all happened to the women who haunted the park, and the women who appeared in those photos and books handed over the counter to favoured customers, wrapped in brown paper. What was particularly hair-raisingly personal was Fitzgerald's depiction of the twilight world of specialist clubs pertaining to types of sexuality that, in the years before the Wolfenden Report, really dared not speak their name. And in the depiction of them I was to discover, he used certain words that were specific to his locale. Let me give you an example of this, as we follow Major Howson through another West 2 portal. At first sight, there is nothing more peculiar about the Gimmick Club than the scores of apparently similar establishments in the distant Soho or the purlieus of Leicester Square. There's a pair of red doors leading straight to a dirty staircase covered in an old brown carpet. At the top of the first flight, there's an alcove with a coin box telephone and a cheap factory-made veneer door labelled "Gents, ladies, one flight up." Adjoining the alcove is a glass door, and this opens into the main club room, from which the bar room is reached by an arched hole in the wall. There is no bar in the club room, only a shelved hatch opening to the bar. It's furnished with Victorian sofas and derelict armchairs. The proprietor is mostly on view in this room, eternally sipping from a glass of champagne. All his friends call him Moss. In the bar room, there is to be found Henry, the pansy barman, He has pretty taste in earrings and bracelets. And for the more virile customers, there is Betty. Betty, like all the members and frequenters of the Gimmick Club, is indeed far from the norm of our healthy British way of life. She wears 5-inch heels in public, which takes a lot of practice, and she's said to be able to walk the room in a 7-inch pair. Her pliable steel corset is famous all over Bayswater, and addicts have come from Manchester and beyond to see her spiked bracelets and snake-fang clips. Betty is what's known in West Tew as a feather, and was one of the reasons why Moss has to be a little particular about his membership. That word, a feather or a feather girl, I'd never come across before. I do have a friend who was brought up around Bayswater in the early 60s when her mother worked at Whitehead's department store. When I asked her if she'd ever heard this term for a dominatrix before, she just shut her eyes and told me it was bringing back a dodgy, dodgy, dodgy world of mews pubs and with hanging baskets, frequented by faux colonels and farmers up for the weekend, of betting men and working girls. The world as Kevin Fitzgerald tells it. There's a similar euphemism deployed for a secret club within a club, which occurs when the action shifts from the Gimmick to Miriam's Place, a mushroom club that's frequently shifting its location within the streets of West Tew. Harrison is told of a glass saloon to which only elite members are allowed and where the action's pretty wild. But like the notion of a feather girl dressed in iron belting her customers with a whip, the glass saloon is so called because transparently it isn't there. And the people who use the term in the book use it as a code, similar to the same way that safe words are deployed in S&L scenarios. I find the duplicity of these terms delightful. And I think it's also worth considering that this world, in which gangsters and spies swirl around the feather girls in the glass saloons, is the same world in which the Profumo affair fermented. And while Trouble in West Tew is ostensibly a spy thriller, it's the access to these secret worlds and the authenticity with which Fitzgerald renders them that makes the book so alluring. I also like the fact that he's put other little personal foibles into the mix. Harrison makes mention of a friend who runs a hotel for climbers in North Wales. And according to David Cox's obituary, mountaineering in North Wales was a passion Fitzgerald discovered in his 40s, shortly after the Second World War, when he discovered that overnight trips from Ireland on the Holyhead mailboat made North Wales really accessible for weekend trips. In a way, says Cox, he was an improbable convert since he had terrifyingly little aptitude for even the easiest climb, and it was a considerable tribute to his intense love of mountains when, having absolutely none of the normal qualifications, he was elected to membership of the Alpine Club. Fitzgerald, as has already been made abundantly clear, was also a bit of a drinker, and he only gave up the large quantities of booty he enjoys alongside Major Harrison when his doctor told him unless he did so, he'd die within months. But with that same Herculean application he used in grappling with mountains, playing rugby and ploughing with horses on his father's land, he managed to give up without any treatment, and in later life apparently gave up much of his time to helping with Alcoholics Anonymous. His love of literature also shines through. During the course of Trouble in West Tew, Harrison mentions Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, from which he takes a hint on always having a revolver placed somewhere in the easy reach of a doorway. Harrison's colleague Feston chides an opponent for never having read Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, as it's left him unable to understand the science of deduction. The pair of them then go on to discuss Green's Brighton Rock, and the similarity between one of their adversaries and Pinky, the juvenile anti-hero of that book. Fitzgerald claimed to have brought at least one book every week of his adult life, all of which he read. He was a member of an exclusive literary group called the Set of Old Volumes, with whom David Cox recalls dining as an absolute pleasure. So it's possible that by evoking these three masters of noir literature in Trouble of West Tew, he was also poking fun at his own attempts at the form. But for me, this book's every bit as precious. It isn't for the dazzling mechanics of the plot that Trouble in West Tew shines, although its twists and turns are indeed thrilling. It's the locations wherein all those shenanigans take place, and all the obvious laugh, knowledge, wit and relish that Fitzgerald pours into his depictions of the cases altered, the Gimmick, Miriams and their down and dirty habitués. To that, and with much gratitude, I raise my glass to him.
novel she was talking about again was Kevin Fitzgerald's Trouble in West 2. Sorry?
You can get it off Amazon, I think. Yeah. Okay. That, yeah.
So, but hurry, it's just been, word is out. I'm going to have a go briefly also at resurrecting a lost London fiction before I throw the session over to you for any questions, any comments, any of your own favourite novels which deserve renewed attention. I'm going to talk very briefly about a novel called A Night in London. There was a moment in the preparation of this session when the title of the session transmogrified from Lost London Fictions to Lost Bloomsbury Fictions, somewhat to the alarm and anxiety of your panel. But this is actually a Lost Bloomsbury fiction. It was written by Sajjad Zahir, and he wrote in Urdu, and the original title was London Ki Ekrat, and it was translated into English, fully translated into English only a couple of years ago and published in India. Sajjad Zahir was from an elite background in Lucknow in North India. He was a Muslim. He came over to England to study and then was a pupil barrister here. He was a communist and a nationalist and one of the founders of the Indian Progressive Writers Association, which is a phenomenally important organisation in Indian cultural history. Their founding meeting was in the basement of the Nanking restaurant in Denmark Street, Tin Pan Alley, which is about 400 yards from here. And on the boat back to India in 1935, he wrote this novella. And he wrote in Urdu as a political act. Obviously, he was fully operational in English. And it's about Indian student life in Bloomsbury. And as the title suggests, it's about one evening when an Indian student with lodgings probably about within 150 yards of where we are now hosts a sort of soiree for his Indian friends, and a couple of English women come along as well. And during the course of the novella, a group go out to the local pub, and there's quite an awkward moment when we've got Indian leftist students who champion the working class having a rather awkward conversation with the Bloomsbury working class, who isn't quite sure what to make of the Indian students, or Indian nationalism, or Gandhi. And the Indian students among themselves then start talking about their own politics, and of course comes the realization fairly evidently that they're leftist and nationalist, but they're all over here because their parents have got money, with the one exception of an Indian woman student who had a full scholarship, who is neither a leftist nor a nationalist. And then as the evening goes on, people start leaving until there is simply the host, who's an Indian postgraduate here, and one white woman left, and they get talking and they're drinking. And she starts opening up about what had happened to her a year earlier when she'd had a romance with an Indian student living in London, and it was a very deep and powerful romance, and then the student had decided that actually the mother country and the national cause was more important, and he jilted her and went back to India, and she hadn't really recovered from that. And it's so powerfully written that it made me wonder, okay, so does that come from Sajjad Zahir, the novelist's own experience? And when the book came out, although it was published in Delhi, there was actually a launch event on Bedford Square, and Sajjad Zahir's niece came along to that occasion, and I sort of asked her, so was there a romance that he had with an English woman who basically jilted? And she said yes, there was. And indeed, he'd come back with one of his relatives and met Alice many decades later. She apparently was living in Manchester. I've not actually managed to get a full name. It's just possible she'd still be living. But I think it's quite intriguing that he's borrowed so heavily on personal experience for a large part of the novel. Sajjad Zahir is a significant figure in Indian literature, and this is not the best known of his works, but it has literary as well as historical importance. And I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from the very beginning of the novel, where he's basically setting the scene. London is cloaked in a swollen, thick fog, yellowish, dense, dark, a blanket of sorts. It's at once damp and cold, covering the entire body, especially the nose and mouth. It's difficult to breathe, and when you do, you feel as though you're inhaling a wet mist. Everything is damp. Tiny droplets of water have collected everywhere. It's not terribly cold, but even this is quite painful. It's afternoon, though it seems that night has set in. No gleam in the streetlights. It appears as if a struggle is raging between darkness and light. The occasional clearing of the fog makes the gaslights flare up. Despite the weather, London does not lack activity. Shops are well lit and the streets are crammed with cars, lorries and buses. On the pavement, where people walk, those leaving their offices, secretaries, clerks, businessmen, typists, students and men and women working in factories scurry past. It is now 6 o'clock, and London's students, intellectuals, the genuine and the fake, those who come to visit England from all nations of the world, stop over at Bloomsbury. This is where England's revolutionary thinkers, artists, expatriates, writers, and all such people who are suspended in a mental void gather, creating a peculiar atmosphere. It is now 6:10, as Anne repeatedly glances at the clock in the Russell Square Underground station. If you can get a copy, and it is available, as I say, it's in print, so you've got to find somebody who imports from India, I'd encourage you to read it, and published in as well as the novella are the founding statements of India's Progressive Writers Association, which is quite an important and historic document, as well as quite a full biographical note of Sajjad Zia. And there are all sorts of coming to London novels. You think of books like Sam Sullivan's The Lonely Londoners. This is a very different coming to London experience, but it's well worth reading. Thank you. I'd like to now throw this open to you for any questions you might have, any London fictions that you think are worth resurrecting, any points of discussion you'd like to raise. Who's going to start us off?
Thank you. I'd just like to ask Ken Worpole, what has happened to London's Irish population between the time you discussed and the present day?
I can only speak as most of us think we know, is that the Irish economic boom halted emigration to this country, and in fact labouring jobs were increasingly taken up by other immigrant groups, Poles, Czechs, Poles, East Europeans, and so on. But it's still a very important, and I think unrecorded history. And I say that I think it was about 250,000 Irish men were working in London, from 45 through to about 1970. Often in lodging houses, very few of them married, and obviously they had a lifestyle that was probably pretty detrimental to their health. They died early of too much drinking, poor working conditions, and so on. But the O'Grady book is one. It's a bit anomalous because it's got photographs. The photographs are by Stephen Pike, but they're actually photographs of rural Ireland, whereas the novel is actually about Irish labourers working in London. Wonderful book. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of era is over, but it still needs to be properly documented.
We've got anybody else who'd like to ask a question, or has got a favourite London novel that you'd like to draw our attention to?
Andrew, you didn't give a date for your novel.
Sorry, it was first published in 1938. It was written a few years earlier, but first published in 1938. But both the novels that you were talking about are pub novels, aren't they?
They are.
And you also talked about The Midnight Bell, which is, again, there's some debate about what the actual pub was which Patrick Hamilton had in mind, but as you say, it's only a short distance from here. And there's a rather glorious tradition of the pub novel in London fiction.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, the pub is like, well, it's the setting for every soap opera, isn't it? It's as Patrick Hamilton realised and utilised so beautifully in The Midnight Bell. It's actually a stage set, and all the characters are going to pass through, and you're going to get to know them the way you do in real life, but you can heighten the tension of that and the speed of it within the novel. And Kevin Fitzgerald does this wonderfully in Travel in West 2 with all these dodgy little Bayswater establishments and the types of villain that run them. And what was fascinating to me was that there was this particular world. There were the villains, but there was also the spy network coming into it, and there was the sex clubs. And this is exactly the world that Profuma had. I mean, it's a really, really interesting parallel.
Roland Camberton's Scamp is also an insignificant part of a pub novel, a rather different sort of pub. It was sort of the Fitzroy Tavern type, sort of Fitzrovia, literary, but Tambi Mutu, heavy drinking editors who both solicit contributions and do the blue penciling in a lounge bar in a pub in Fitzrovia. Again, quite local to this area.
And I think also it takes over from the early 20th century London novel, which is very much the novel around the rooming house or the tenement block. So you get number 5, number 5 John Street, you get the L-shaped room,
the Lowlife?
The Lowlife, but I'm thinking of the very famous Not London Belongs to Me.
London Belongs to Me is a rooming house, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, as Cathi was saying, the rooming house is a place where people are coming and going all day, stopping on the stairs, having a conversation. The Lowlife, is a rooming house novel as well. So the setting is kind of theatrical, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can see a lot of these novels really on stage. Yeah.
I know that Patrick Hamilton did write the stage before he wrote novels as well, so he's got that tradition. But he also wrote London Belongs to Me. I love the way that novel is constructed, because you just follow each character, and it starts off with the people in the basement and goes up and up, and you find out all these little families' lives, different families that live in this house. And I think that's a really fantastic way of constructing a novel, in a way like a soap opera again, because you never get so much bogged down with one person that the next person moves the plot along wonderfully.
Well, there's a famous Patrick Hamilton rooming house novel, which is...
Craving Hair.
Come on.
State of Solitude.
State of Solitude, yeah. With the,
Yeah.
And then there's J.B. Priestley's Angel Pavement, which is about people working together in the same firm, which from memory it's a veneer shop somewhere in the city Shoreditch area. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And taking... and following people back to their homes. So the proprietor lives in St John's Wood. I think one of the people who works there as a communist lives in Kentish Town. And it's what brings them together is their workplace on Angel Pavement. I've never quite worked out exactly where Angel Pavement is in the city. But please.
It's the only one mentioned about women, those women writers.
One of the most 5 Leaves who published this book have also recently published a book by a really lost, probably the first female British beatnik author actually. Her book came out shortly before Lynn Reed-Banks. She's called Laura Del Rivo, and her book is called The Furnished Room, and it was made into a film in 1962, I think, by Michael Winner, with Diana Dawes in it, and a great screenplay that Keith Whitehead and Willis Hall did. But it sticks very closely to her book, and her book is fantastic. And Laura's a really interesting person, especially from considering the sort of experience of women in the early 60s. She came up from the suburbs. She had a very strict Roman Catholic upbringing, which she wanted to escape from, and she went straight to, interestingly enough, the pub that Andrew's just mentioned in Fitzrovia, the Wheat Sheaf, where she came across a little ensemble of writers, which included Colin Wilson. and she ended up sharing a house in West 11 with Colin Wilson, with Dudley Sutton, the actor. It was a place where the two famous fighting Roberts, the actors, the painters, Robert Calhoun and McBride, had lived. It was this very bohemian house. And when we'd had this, a previous event where I talked about the L-shaped room, little Lidwy Banks actually turned up, so no pressure. I was a little scared, but luckily she did really like what I'd said about her book. And I said to her, because I knew that her book wasn't actually set in West 11, although the Brian Forbes film was, and I think it works better than in Fulham where her book was set. I think it would have more plausibly happened. But that she had based the rooming house on somewhere she'd been to in West 11. And I found out on that day that the place she had been to in West 11 was the house where Laura Del Rive, Colin Wilson and Dudley Sutton had said. That was fascinating, but those two had never met each other. And I'd quite like to engineer an event in which they could meet each other now. Because Laura said she was always being mistaken for Lynn Reed Banks as well, because the furnished room, the L-shaped room, same milieu, same time. Really interesting stuff. Sorry, Ken.
Yeah, no. I mean, obviously there were novelists like Elizabeth Bowen and Elizabeth Taylor, I think, who wrote Mrs. Palfrey at the Clem, and there was a kind of tradition of the hotel, the guest house novel as well. And then Up the Junction later came along. So, yeah, we could actually, in the book, I think many of these are actually discussed, aren't they? Yeah. But it's a fascinating thing to do with this, the context, you know, the street, the rooming house, the hotel, the cheap hotel, the pub, and the kind of life that flows through it, which is, I don't think it's typical for London, but it's very, the London novel seems to find its, you know, real form in those kind of situations.
Yeah, because I guess it's the place that's going to bring together everyone from all these disparate backgrounds.
Yeah.
And also, as you can tell from the bits that we both read, as a writer, it's really, my favourite thing is writing about pubs. It's a really good environment to write about. I hate it.
That's probably a good note on which to end, isn't it? I'm going to end now because I realise some of you may have another session to go to at 3 o'clock. I have brought along a few copies of London Fictions if you want to see it. It's being sold at a third off the retail price, which means it's cheaper here today than it is on Amazon. There's also a website, www.londonfictions.com, which is broadly supplements the book and has items about 30 or 40 London novels, some lost, some happily not lost at all, but doing rather well. But please join me in thanking Ken and Cathi. Thank you.